All right, also, folks, today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Theory and Method within Human Sexuality. So really, Chapter 2 is all about human sexuality research. And so we're going to begin looking at theory, and theory can be kind of dry depending on how it's approached. It's not necessarily the most fun or the sexiest topic. It's probably not why you signed up to take the course, but yes, theory is a part of how we understand and ultimately come to appreciate the great majority of human sexual behavior, attitude, and outlook. Keep in mind that theories are tools for understanding, that these are ways to understand something, that theories are used to understand and explain data. So that's ultimately what we want to really underscore here. And the data that we're talking about trying to understand and explain ultimately are human sexual behaviors in our case. Keep in mind that each theory by itself is a set of assumptions. It's a set of ideas about how things work, either within society or within the body or some combination, again, depending on the theory and, of course, the subject matter being human sexuality. The theories are wide-ranging. And so that's also something to keep in mind, that folks within the great field of human sexuality come from a variety of different disciplines. Some come from psychology, economics, sociology, anthropology. It really runs the gamut, including, of course, medicine and the natural sciences. So theories are often created and tailored to unique attributes of fields and subfields that are related to human sexuality as well. So again, the data on human sexual behavior that we observe, we can explain by the theory and the assumptions of the theory or theories that we're using. So we can break the theories that we look at down into some unique, discrete types. The first of which would be psychologically based theories or psychological theories. And so we're talking, for instance, about cognitive theory. We're talking also about humanistic psychology, as well as psychoanalytic theory. And so with psychological theories, with whatever one we're looking at, ultimately the goal of psychologically based theory is to look at what are the motivations for the individual's behavior. What are the reasons why the person is choosing to have sex this way or behave sexually in a particular manner. And so any of these psychological theories are trying to explain unique attributes of individual behavior, and they can look again and examine at the motivations, sort of the underlying reasons for why the behavior is actually occurring. So with psychoanalytic theory, we're looking at that melding and that blending of conscious and unconscious drives and instincts that Freud talked about and so effectively championed. For instance, if we're looking at cognitive psychology and cognitive-based psychological theories, we're looking at unique thought processes and how do we individually process and have cognition, if you will, mentally with respect to human sexual behavior. And with humanistic psychology, we're looking at the efforts that we make to achieve and what motivates us to achieve and do and to have our very best. So questions that psychologically based theories might ask or resolve related to human sexuality research could include the following. How are we motivated to choose sexual partners, particularly the unique partners that we end up choosing? And how do we perceive attractiveness? What cognitive processes are involved in our perception uniquely of attractive people and persons? We can also, with respect to theory, we can look at things sociologically and look at human sexuality from the perspective of sociological theories. And so with sociological theory, we're looking at how behavior is rooted within society and how it's based within society in terms of its laws, culture, customs, and certainly gender. And so we're looking at how societies create norms, ordinary everyday standards and expectations of human behavior that we're all expected to fit and conform to and adopt. And so a lot of what happens to us isn't just inside, it happens to us externally, or at least it is the result of external influences that are tied to us and that we're connected to within society as well. So one thing that sociological theories remind us of is that behavior changes from place to place. And so what we see that is okay or widely accepted in one society isn't necessarily going to be the case in some other kind of place or society. And so it's not all simply up to the motivations or the experiences of the individual. We have to also look at the context that the individual is living in or is playing in or something of that sort. Where are they rooted? What society, what culture, what time frame are they based in? What social context are they in? And what might it say or share have to do with their unique human sexual behavior or that of many other people within a group or society? Also within the sociological theory grouping, we're looking at feminist theory and we're looking at queer theory. And both of these theories have long questioned heteronormative attitudes and the assumptions that the world is a straight place. Heterosexism, for instance, is that concept that really says, hey, wait a second, the world isn't automatically straight, but again, we're often taught to think that that is the universally accepted okay model for sexual behavior and sexual attitudes. And so both feminist theory and queer theories, they remind us that there isn't a natural sexuality, there isn't a natural ordinary sexual orientation, that variety really ultimately is the spice of life. Both feminist theory and queer theory, as sociologically based theories, they call to question or they call into question gender hierarchies, and that they remind us that gender is a system of dominance where typically men, cisgendered men, have dominated women and less powerful men among other members of society over time. So if we look at things from a sociological standpoint, here are the kinds of questions that they could ask in a research context. They could ask, how is sexuality rooted in power and privilege? Also, they could ask, how does legal change impact sexual behavior? For instance, if we look at the legal status of gay and lesbian folks and gay and lesbian marriage within our society, or transgendered folks. So how do legal statuses, if you will, impact individuals within those communities and beyond in our society and culture? We also can't leave out biologically based theories. And so here we're looking at the role of genetics, DNA, we're looking at the physiological and the impact that it has on our behavior. And so overwhelmingly, the biologically based theories have said that when it comes down to it, that our behavior sexually is biologically based, that it's the expression of genes, DNA, of physiological attributes of that which is passed down from our biological parentage among other family members. And so a lot of what we experience in terms of our overt sexual behavior, in terms of direct sexual experience and contact, in terms of even love and mate selection, that a lot of those are ultimately physiologically based and physiologically controlled. And if there are problems there, they can be, in a sense, solved or rooted out through a medical model or a medical basis. And so a lot of how problem resolution occurs with respect to the biological model looks at things from a medical standpoint. So in a sense, what is the problem that could be fixed by the role of science, by the medical community, by the medical establishment? That's also another thing to keep in mind too, that human sexuality among the maelstrom and the range of social sciences grew up and was established to create and solve social problems. And so ultimately we're looking at a social science that is multidisciplinary, that involves a lot of different attributes of unique fields and subdisciplines. We also have to talk with theory, we have to bring up some of the research methods that are commonly used within human sexuality. And with the methods, any research method ultimately involves how you go about getting your data. If you've got a research question to ask, you've got to go about getting the information that you need in some kind of way to resolve the question you're asking. And so here are some examples of commonly used research methods within human sexuality and other social science related fields. One would be in-depth interviews. So you'll see an example of this when you read the We Don't Sleep Around academic paper for your second literature review. And so for that academic research, the researcher sociologist Yenli Espiritu did in-depth interviews with about 100 Filipino Americans in and around San Diego, California. And in doing so, she was able to ask them much richer kinds of questions and get at a much bigger, more in-depth sampling and also discussion of the issues that she was ultimately concerned about, particularly sexuality within the Filipino community, especially as it relates to Filipinas, as it relates to Filipino women. Participant observation is also another, if you will, research method that is commonly used within human sexuality. And that's when a study goes on where the researcher is studying something while he or she is actively a part of it. So let's say, for instance, someone wants to do a study of speed dating. They would actually be, or embark, if you will, on the research or the study of speed dating by actually doing it themselves. And this was done to great effect, particularly during the early 70s, when studies and the discussion of mate swapping, swinging, was much more, in a sense, risque, but also much more common as a sense of, oh, okay, well, people might actually engage in this sort of behavior. So Paulson and Paulson, they were a team of anthropological researchers, a married anthropological research team that actually went out and for the research decided that they would swap and share and swing. And so this is a great example of how that would be done. So you would, again, engage in the phenomenon, engage in it, put yourself in it, but at the same time you would also observe what was going on around you. And so this, kind of like in the interview-based research, can provide great depth of quality with respect to the goal of resolving the question that you're trying to answer or that you're asking. Another good example would be direct observation, and a lot of this is more commonly associated with the medical model. Let's say, for instance, if a condom manufacturer wants to understand how their condom would work in a real in vivo type of setting, they would actually have people put them on in a laboratory setting or have people try to initiate sexual activity in such a setting. This direct observation was done to great effect by Masters and Johnson, the medically based research team that felt, well, since we didn't have much medical information, there wasn't much about the charting of attributes and physical behaviors involved in sexual activity while they were doing their research. They felt, well, this is what has to be done, that we need to embark on this in order to resolve those questions and to come up with answers for the future that would guide future research. And so again, with direct observation, you're looking at the phenomenon of sexual behavior directly. You're right there examining it firsthand. And also what is done increasingly by text or by app or in some other fashion that is technologically based. One other common example that you probably know fairly well would be questionnaires. And so there the researcher asks a series of questions involving a topic that might be categorized in one way, shape, or form depending on how the respondent, if you will, answers unique questions, patterns within questions, and so on and so forth. And so the classic studies that are questionnaire based are the mall intercept ones, where you're walking around a mall and somebody walks up to you and they say, okay, well, would you like to participate in this study? We'll give you this, that sort of thing, or whatever. We see this a lot now, even online if we're making a purchase. Some kinds of questionnaire based research can be attached to that as well. Right? One of the main things, though, we want to make clear that we often want to go after within human sexual research or other kinds of social science research is often what the researcher is going for is some kind of generalizability. They want the research findings to be able to say something more about the public and about what the average person might be going through. And so if the researcher finds a carefully selected sample of respondents to do the research with, that set of respondents carefully selected can mirror or approximate what attitudes and behaviors are like in the average everyday population. And so often that's what the study is trying to go after. And so that's one thing to sort of ask when you hear about studies that are quoted, be it in the media, be it online, what have you. Is that a generalizably based study? Was it truly something based upon a good, well collected random sample, what quality of sample does it have? And if it does, it can be scaled up to say, okay, here's what we found in the sample. What we found in the sample definitely will match the population based upon the characteristics of the population and the sample being very much alike. Also, what we have to keep in mind in the research process are what we call ethics. These are standards of professional conduct and moral behavior in the research setting. So researchers don't have the right to just subject people to any kind of condition. We have to, number one, inform those that we are doing research with and on that we are indeed researchers. We also have to gain their approval, their consent to be a part of the process. They can't just naturally be assumed to be a part of it or that they're supposed to be. Our research respondents are volunteers. So they need some kind of document that demonstrates that, hey, you're volunteering for this, you have rights, here's how we're going to protect them, and here's what we're providing as far as information about the study. And so here's the contact information that you can use to get in contact with us if you have questions. And so we call that ethical standard informed consent. You're letting them know what the research is all about, and you're gaining their approval to be a part of it. Another good example of an ethical guideline to follow, something that's professional and moral, is what we call confidentiality. This is basically a declaration of keeping things confidential. The researcher says, you know what, your personal information will not breach the boundaries of this research project or this research process. And so generally information may be, if you will, across respondents discussed with respect to the research findings, but individual unique participants can't have their unique information shared in a way that would out them or personalize the research. So we have to, as researchers, maintain that confidentiality standard to, again, protect the inherent dignity of human subjects.